Hi, my name is Juliet, and I'm the creator and host of Connecting the Dots podcast. I love ideas and problem solving, and my career in communication has led me down a path of curiosity. Why we do what we do, how we tell better stories, and how African scientists solve everyday problems. Join me on this enlightening and entertaining exploration of African science like you've never experienced before. Get ready to laugh, learn, and be inspired. So, ladies and gentlemen, Connecting the Dots podcast is in Cape Town, South Africa. We are on a quest to learn more about microscopic organisms that live on your skin, gut, and, of course, vagina. In a previous episode, Professor Thumbi gave us insights into how the HIV virus works. Today, we're shifting focus to explore why women and girls are disproportionately affected by HIV. The numbers are staggering, with adolescent girls and young women 3 times more likely to contract HIV than their male peers. Our guest today helps us unpack key factors behind this disparity, including untreated sexually transmitted infections, STIs, and conditions like bacterial vaginosis, BV, which disrupt the body's natural balance and increases vulnerability to HIV. Joanne Passmore is a professor at the Institute of Infectious Diseases and Molecular Medicine, University of Cape Town. She is passionate about research that benefits the people where she lives and has dedicated her career to preventing HIV in women in Africa. Professor Passmore's research focuses on women's sexual and reproductive health, including improving the diagnosis and treatment of genital tract inflammation for women and adolescent girls in sub-Saharan Africa. She and her team at the University of Cape Town, along with Lindy Mason at the Burnet Institute in Melbourne, Australia, have been developing a remarkable social innovation that holds the potential to revolutionize STI diagnosis and treatment. We're very excited to learn more about your outstanding work. Welcome, Professor Passmore.
Thank you for the opportunity.
So, Prof. Passmore, we always start, or we love to begin this podcast by just getting to know you a little bit. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing, just your personal life, and then your professional career, and what influenced your career pathway. Over to you.
I was born in Durban, in KwaZulu-Natal, and in the 70s. And I'm the single child of teenage parents, as contraceptive was not a widely accessible thing in the 70s. And the other part of my formative experiences was my father was a polio child from the 50s. He was born in 1950s in Durban and KwaZulu-Natal and suffered from polio. So viruses have been part of my life in a very real sense for the longest time. Passionate about biochemistry, in particular immunology, and that led me down this path. I was fascinated with vaccines and the immune system in general, and an opportunity came up to study clinical immunology at the University of Cape Town, which is about 2,000 kilometers away from home. So it was a little bit of a shift in where I was living. And I came down here and I obtained a PhD in the late 90s from Department of Medicine. And my first postdoctoral fellowship was probably the most formative in terms of laying down the passion I had for female reproductive health, because I did a postdoctoral fellowship on papillomavirus at a time in papillomavirus history when it was the first cancer that was confirmed to be associated with a viral infection, particular cervical cancer, and there's obviously a massive public health need to address cervical cancer. So for the first formative years of my post PhD work focused on HPV prevention. It was a time when the papillomavirus vaccine was being developed and tested in humans for the first time. So I grew up with the HPV vaccine, and I was fortunate enough to be part of that journey. And I've always said that papillomavirus is the best teacher of mucosal immunity
Yeah.
and reproductive tract health, and that led me down another very important path in my career in terms of HIV prevention research, where my skills as a mucosal immunologist with this background in STI research could really make a contribution.
And just to understand a little bit more on mucosal surfaces, what do we mean? What are these surfaces when you talk about mucosal immunity?
So the many infections we get at all stages of our lives enter the human body via mucosal surfaces of the nasal passages, the inside of your mouth is that wet mucosa.
Mm-hmm.
Your gastrointestinal tract is a mucosal surface that lives in harmony most of the time with the outside world, but it's also the sites that most new bacterial and viral infections into humans. And then, of course, the gastrointestinal tract leads to the rectal passage. And the most important in my frame of reference is the female reproductive tract, because that ultimately is the beginning of life. It leads to the upper reproductive tract and the uterus. So those surfaces of the lower reproductive tract of women, upper reproductive tract, those are mucosal surfaces that come in contact with viruses and bacteria from the outside world.
And this week, you are hosting the first African Microbiomes in Health and Disease Symposium. And we are very keen to be able to understand a bit more from you on, the amazing world of microscopic organisms, and why they matter, how important they are, what role they play in women's health. Can you just expound a little bit about that and talk about the symposium and also the work that you're doing and why that particular meeting is taking place?
So the workshop is a call to action, if you want, to start a discussion with fellow microbiome researchers in South Africa, across Africa, Kenya, Zambia, partners from Zambia, as well as our global North partners. The microbiome in particular is really important to focus on if you are me and you focus on mucosal surfaces health. And until about 15 years ago, we really didn't appreciate the role of the microbiome in maintaining our mucosal surfaces in a healthy state. So historically, we always felt that microorganisms were not good to have around and they should
Right.
be obliterated at all costs.
Yeah.
And we didn't appreciate that actually our bodies, all mucosal surfaces, our mouths, our guts, our vaginas, our uteruses, well, have a community of what are known as commensal bacteria, microbes that live in harmony with our surfaces and are very much part of our mucosal immune system.
Yeah.
They help us metabolize drugs, they digest food for us, they do a whole bunch of health promoting functions that really ensure that the mucosal barrier of our, the human is intact. It's strong, it's an impenetrable barrier against the outside invading pathogens. And, in terms of medical philosophy discussions ongoing, they're not really seen as foreign. If you're a mucosal immunologist, the microbiome is really goes hand in hand with the mucosal surface of the human cells in terms of how they function together in symbiosis. So having this opportunity in Cape Town over the past week or this week to discuss these, the importance of these microbiomes in human health as well as disease, it's really been instrumental on placing it front and center in terms of how we think about prevention and preventative medicine.
I love the reference to good bacteria. I think we always forget that. And I think we noted in COVID times, we started washing our hands. And I know one of the things that I was thinking a lot is, are we washing away our good bacteria by making sure that we're constantly washing our hands? That those bacteria that really do work for the body. And it sounds like from your work, there are good bacteria to have, and then there are bad bacteria to have. Tell me, what happens when bacteria do go rogue? Because, looking at your work and just trying to understand a bit more about your career pathway, we understood that you are beginning to work with bacterial vaginosis, and also when the temperature goes a bit off what it should be, and also its impact to STIs. So just expound a little bit on that.
So I mean, that's exactly to your point. That's exactly, if we could put them under probably an inappropriate banner of the good bacteria, they are health promoting bacteria that live in synergy with our bodies, and their presence excludes other bacteria from coming in. And to use an analogy that we all can appreciate, if you think of the vaginal microbiome in particular, the good or health promoting bacteria in a female vaginal mucosa is lactobacillus. It's a very specific species of bacteria that dominates in that area. It also excludes acid sensitive bacteria, and many bacteria are acid sensitive. So in that way, they promoting biocontrol of pathogens coming in, because the environment they're creating to ensure their own health and happiness excludes other bacteria that aren't as acid tolerant as they are. So to put the analogy into like a garden, where you've got a lawn and you've got this beautiful green lush lawn where all the lawn seeds represent lactobacilli,
Yeah.
you are going to get these weeds popping up every now and then, and the weeds would represent a dysbiosis when the beautiful lawn is overridden by these more diverse organisms that come in and try to take hold of that environment. But if the grass and the grass seeds are strong and the soil is good, the grass will prosper and the bad bacteria or the weeds can't get a good stronghold and they're outcompeted. So you mentioned bacterial vaginosis is when, for whatever reason, multiple environmental and biological reasons, that the lactobacilli might disappear. It creates this like fallow ground, where there isn't this strength in numbers for the grass, but where the weeds can come in and prosper. And then you get this diverse array of other bacteria that come into that environment to set up camp, because there's this bare earth that the lactobacilli have. And, so in that way, that diversity that the weeds bring are bad for the soil. They don't promote health in the same way as the grass would have been feeding the soil if you would have it. So that's the analogy I often refer to when you think of the vaginal microbiome, is this beautifully kept lawn, where no weeds shall prosper.
I love that analogy, because one of the things it's got me thinking is about, agriculture, and maybe to extend the analogy a little bit, Prof, if you will allow me. I'm imagining if you have a beautiful garden and suddenly, you're not using your usual water and natural, manure, and you begin to use maybe pesticide, you then create this environment for other invasive species, if we can call them that, to grow. And I wonder if the analogy also is true for the vagina, for example. We've seen women beginning to use some of these high-end products that are being sold, some quite expensive. And I do have the question of which scientist has researched on these products and are they recommended? I've had, again, in our previous podcast, we had one of your colleagues, Professor Obimbo Moses, and he was insistent that women, even the douching practice is not necessary. So would you agree to that?
Absolutely. I think one of the ways bacterial vaginosis is currently treated, and there've been no new innovations for bacterial vaginosis, which is so common in women, for more than 50 years. But one of the ways it is treated most commonly is with an antibiotic called metronidazole. And that antibiotic basically clears the garden of the weeds and everything,
Yeah.
and leaves the bare soil. And I think the issue with something as powerful as an antibiotic, in most cases, within 6 months, the woman will have a recurrence of bacterial vaginosis. It's not a cure for bacterial vaginosis. It's a short-term treatment. And your analogy of like a pesticide. So when you think of antibiotics, it's probably the most potent microbicide we know. But for many social reasons as well, there's a lot of stigma around female reproductive health and disease, particularly things like odor. A woman, they're perceived as being dirty if they have a vaginal odor. There's a lot of pressure on women to have a fresh vagina, and that is used in marketing practices, and all the products you've been talking about are to eliminate odor, to clean, to keep clean, because the vagina is not branded globally and in Africa as a clean organ, but it's actually the most amazing organ in the human body. It's self-cleaning. It does not need to be washed
Self-cleaning.
and cleaned. And a lot of the products that are marketed for douching, for vaginal odor, they actually counterintuitively disrupt the microbiome and make it a place that lactobacilli, the good bacteria, don't find very hospitable, and they battle to
Right.
take hold in them. So while you're trying to eliminate odor and signs of bacterial vaginosis, you're also not, through using these products, creating an environment in which lactobacilli can take a foothold, set up camp, and really colonize. And that's ultimately what you want to do. You don't want to eliminate stuff. You want to sow seeds into your garden, grass seeds, so that the good bacteria love it there, and they grow and flourish. So, I 100% agree with Dr. Bimbo's recommendation against cleaning, particularly internal cleaning, because the vagina's got this beautiful mechanism through its secretions from the upper reproductive tract, the mucus that washes down, is packed with these really potent antimicrobial peptides that does a brilliant job at not disrupting the good microbiome or the bacteria, but actually they're really hostile against the invading pathogens. And I think that's the balance that gets disrupted if there's some kind of exogenous agent put in, like a cream or a wash or a douche.
Yeah, and it sounds like, you're strongly advocating to use antibacterials or antibiotics sparingly. And it also sounds, from a public health perspective, water at the very basic minimum is just as sufficient, especially given, the use of the phrase self-cleaning organ. I really love that. I don't think there are many, maybe the ears, I don't know, even with the mouth, sometimes we need to brush our teeth often. But it's very interesting to hear that. Tell me, what happens when untreated BV is left to itself, and what does that do to heightening the risk of HIV infection?
So, bacterial vaginosis is commonly quite difficult to diagnose. It's often clinically invisible to nurses at reproductive health clinics and to women. So, if I asked you or myself, like, what does my normal amount of discharge look like? Most of us
I
don't,
don't
we're not
know.
that finely tuned with our bodies that we know what is normal and what is not. And what you will see with bacterial vaginosis is an increase in the discharge, the color changes, potentially the smell changes as well. And I think in the cases of untreated bacterial vaginosis, where you don't have access to medication like antibiotics to get rid of it, or live biotherapeutics to replace the good bacteria, there's this level of inflammation, like imagine sore, swelling, red tissue. So a lot of these quite potent immune chemicals are released to that area to try and mop up the dysbiosis, or its immune system trying to clear what's going on down there. And that low level of inflammation is really damaging, also counterintuitively, to your mucosal barrier. An inflamed mucosal barrier is much easier for an HIV virion to transfer from your vaginal outside environment and infect cells coming into that inflamed environment. And then it infects its target cells, and basically it can then spread systemically. So an intact mucosal barrier with no inflammation is really hard for HIV to transmit across that mucosal barrier, and bacterial vaginosis undermines that. But it's more than just the HIV risk, which we put a number to that the risk of becoming HIV infected if you've got genital tract inflammation is you threefold more at higher risk of becoming infected. So inflammation at its root cause is a significant risk factor. And bacterial vaginosis, of all the studies we've done, bacterial vaginosis is so common and is one of the most inflammatory conditions females experience in terms of their mucosal barrier integrity. But the other side of it, and potentially more devastating in many ways is the impact of that inflammation from bacterial vaginosis untreated on pregnancy outcomes. So you put risk to your unborn child from ascending movement of these inflammatory bacteria into the uterus. You put the development of the fetus at risk. You put the woman at higher risk of preterm delivery, small for gestational age infants, spontaneous abortion. It's also been associated with something called pelvic inflammatory disease, where the inflammation becomes a lot more systemic in the reproductive tract, and that's incompatible with fertility. So if you've got a very inflamed upper reproductive tract, your chance of carrying a fertilized embryo through to pregnancy is diminished. And then also the impact on fertility. So in that very inflamed environment, the chance of fertility is reduced. So it like spans the full spectrum of birth outcomes, which is a major part of most women's, adult life is centered around reproduction and carrying children to delivery successfully. But then also it puts you at risk of really life-altering infections like HIV.
And, we've heard from the symposium, we're now going into day 2 of the symposium, that about 80% of women are affected by BV, asymptomatic. You might not know that you have it. For me, it was staggering to understand that even the research from the continent in terms of the African microbiome, in terms of vaginal microbiomes, there's not a lot that has been done for the last 50 years. And correct me if I'm wrong on the statistics here. So I'm wondering, what are the gaps when it comes to testing and treatment for BV and STIs? And also attached to this question, maybe you'd want to talk about the genital inflammation test that you and your team, developed, which was very exciting to see this come out of UCT as well.
So in terms of what we've been focusing on at this workshop is running under a title of the missing African microbiomes, and why this is so important, not just for Africa, but for the global community. At the moment, as data stands, global databases are, imagine a big library of information about all the books there are in the world, but all these global databases have information about what microbiomes look like in humans living in different parts of the world, including women, including their reproductive health. But if that library is only carrying a very small section of one shelf that has information about African microbiomes, the missed opportunities there are massive. So if you did a whole review of what was in the library and took that library to reflect world microbiomes, the fact that Africa makes up like less than 1% or less than 2% of that global information completely skews the decisions you'll make about all that available information. And therefore, the world isn't seeing the full map of what microbiomes look like in humans. And particularly in my field, reproductive microbiomes are massively underrepresented. And this is important for Africa because if we're trying to understand a disease like bacterial vaginosis, which is a dysbiosis so common here, as it is in many other parts of the world, we need to understand what our bacterial vaginosis looks like. So as we design new therapies and new drugs and new treatments, we know what we're treating. We don't, under the mistaken banner, we don't think we've got the same microbiomes as the US or Europe. We have a unique set of microbes that are resident in our bacterial vaginosis, and the drugs and strategies we are developing need to take that into account and need to be targeted at that problem, not this bigger problem in which African microbiomes are poorly represented. But on the other side of it, it's really a missed opportunity for the global north, because their vision of what microbiomes look like in women is completely skewed, and health promoting properties of African microbiomes and what is good in the context of health versus disease could be harnessed by the global north to treat women for bacterial vaginosis. And ultimately, a new treatment for bacterial vaginosis or a cure could come out of an African microbiome in terms of our massive biodiversity. And that's a missed opportunity that we're going to be leveraging through this initiative. So one of the key things that you mentioned that we discovered very early on in the research is that symptomatic, so women knowing whether they've got an STI or bacterial vaginosis, or the nurses and doctors are treating them have clear evidence of signs and symptoms of an infection, is very rare in most women. So like about 12% of cases of bacterial vaginosis or an STI is clinically evident. That means 88% of women are asymptomatic. Analogous to the iceberg, where the tip is the symptomatic woman that we know there's a problem.
Yeah.
There's this massive body of ice underneath the water, which is invisible infections that women don't know they have. So in a region like South Africa, which doesn't have easy access to true points of care tests that are affordable to diagnose these conditions, and South Africa, in addition to many regions in LMICs, use something called syndromic management guidelines from the WHO, where women will only access treatment for an STI or BV if they have signs or symptoms.
Wow.
So, if you've got 88% of the women don't have those signs and symptoms, they won't be accessing treatment, and they won't, they run the risk of having this untreated inflammation that has all these other severe, sequelae. So what we did very early on is we started to characterize subclinical biomarkers of inflammation that we could detect very sensitively, more sensitively than the human eye of the clinician and the nurses and the woman.
Yeah.
And this could be a screening tool that would allow women with these asymptomatic infections to accelerate their health-seeking behavior. And then they would say, I know there's something going on. I need access to etiological tests. I need access to treatments because of this subclinical inflammation. And that's where we developed this genital inflammation test, which is based on upregulation of two very inflammatory molecules in humans. And if detected in vaginal swabs that women could self-collect or the nurse could collect for them, put it onto the test. If a band develops on the lateral flow test, think pregnancy test. So you'd get the vaginal sample moving across the matrix in front of you. And if the band appears in the little window of what looks like a pregnancy test, and I've got one here, so I'm actually show you my little pregnancy test. But if you get a little band forming in the window, that tells you you've got elevated inflammation, that you should look for help to diagnose further. And it's very strategically being positioned to fit into a WHO algorithm or a Department of Health algorithm to allow better catchment of those asymptomatic infections.
That's amazing. And I was going to say, Joanne, for all the listeners who are listening on the podcast on Spotify, if you end up watching this particular podcast on YouTube, you'll see that just behind Joanne, she has this big, really life-size model of the pregnancy looking like kids. I think that's just impressive. And the fact that women can just be testing themselves, from their own convenience at home. I mean, this just makes access to medicine so much better, especially when you're saying 88% of women are asymptomatic and could be missed, which means that they are being left open to getting, other infections. And I think the risk, especially for pregnant women, is significantly higher for the baby and as well for them to carry the baby to term. Joanne, let's do a fun question, one about myths. So I've been asked to ask you to bust some myths that are out there about vaginal microbiomes, BV. I don't know. What myths do you hear that drive you nuts?
Oh my gosh, don't get me started. So we've touched on a little bit about, that the vagina is dirty and it's smelly, and we've got a lot of work to do at a social behavioral level to reframe the vagina and its in its beauty and its life-giving properties and focus more on that.
Yeah.
So the other myth is bacteria aren't all bad, There are many very health promoting bacteria, as we have discussed in the microbiome. And I think that's a big one.
Uh-huh.
Germs are not all bad. If you want to kind of categorize all bacteria as germs, there's some very good ones out there.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. This next question, it's on which scientists inspire you?
Okay, so for a long time, the most inspirational scientists I've worked with are the likes of Professor Lynette Denny, who passed away earlier this year. And she's been a massive champion for cervical cancer prevention, HPV, and a massive mentor in my career. And then also, you know, obviously, Professor Elizabeth Bakuzi, who opened our meeting yesterday, amazing champion in HIV prevention,
And a beautiful
inspirational,
presentation.
deeply, yeah, deeply compassionate person.
So, Joanne, your team is working on creating better treatments for bacterial vaginosis, BV, using the natural microbiome of African women. Can you explain the vision for that and how that process works in very simple terms?
So what the starting point with all of this is to map out what microbiomes in the vagina of women in Africa look like through 2 menstrual cycles. So we're doing a longitudinal study in Kenya with KEMRI, Kisumu, and in South Africa with the Department Desmond Tutu HIV Foundation here in Cape Town at Masiphumelele, and we are looking at women of reproductive age who are otherwise healthy and are willing to participate in a 10-week study. We're getting them to take vaginal swabs twice a week, and this will give us really good insight into what characterizes vaginal health for women in 2 countries in Africa. And using that information, we can then look into the particular microbes in women with these really stable, long-term lactobacillus dominated communities. And we can isolate those bacteria. We can characterize them in the lab and put them together in combination with each other to develop what's called a live biotherapeutic. Most of the world would know that as a probiotic,
Yeah.
where you put all the good bacteria together in a capsule. So we will be taking these living bacteria, putting them into some kind of vaginal pessary or vaginal applicator that can be delivered into the reproductive tract of women with bacterial vaginosis. And in the same way, you're taking these really healthy, good bacteria from women with stable vaginal microbiomes, you can transplant them into women with bacteria that have kind of gone awry and all the weeds have appeared. And those good bacteria can then promote health in the vagina of the woman with really persistent bacterial vaginosis and displace the bad bacteria and promote colonization with health promoting bacteria. So that is the vision for Africa, is that we part of this journey creating a product with women in Africa in mind that contain good health promoting bacteria from Africa that can be used in therapy for bacterial vaginosis.
I mean, that's just impressive. And I'm wondering, if there's an example that comes to mind where a similar process has been undertaken in the medical field. Is there anything similar to what you're trying to do?
So there's a massive opportunity that it's been harnessed in the gastrointestinal tract space. So in the same way as many of us would have been prescribed probiotics after antibiotic treatment for a gastroenteritis or some inflammation of the gastrointestinal tract, health promoting bacteria have been used in that space for many
Oh,
years,
wow.
particularly the most severe cases of gastrointestinal inflammation, like irritable bowel syndrome. Many of us will know difficulties with inflammation of the gastrointestinal tract lead to all sorts of very negative health outcomes. And there's been really sophisticated precision medicine in that space that have shown the power of manipulating the microbiome to improve health.
I think it's very impressive the work that you're undertaking on the vaginal microbiome, and I think even whatever you will come up with, it sounds like it's going to be very useful to the global world, not actually north or south. And I think also I believe you are right when you say the microbiome in Africa is completely different if you think about our diets, think about our genetics, think about our environment, completely different. And just staying on the topic of reproductive health, I wonder if you could wave a magic wand. What topic or information would you want to see being shared more and more when it comes to sexual education or even reproductive health education?
So I'm a education campaigner, particularly in this field, and there's really like an absolute valuable opportunity within the tertiary, not tertiary education, but secondary high school education system to educate women about their biology, about the beautifulness of their biology and reproductive health. And I'm not sure we're harnessing it. It's very politically charged area where parents don't want too much information to be given to their pre-sexual adolescents, minors, and I think in terms of being an activist for changing that and making sex education in schools a much stronger focus, so that women have the vocabulary, the knowledge to negotiate their own uh, sexual relationships with their partners. They have the words they need to use. They also have the words they need to use with um, their clinical support teams, their doctors, their nurses, as they go into getting contraceptives, the impact of those contraceptives on their health and well-being. These are essential things. These aren't things that you withhold because of fear of, putting ideas in the minds of young people. These are essential. This is essential knowledge about what it is to be a woman. And like, when is the right time to have those conversations? And I would argue the right time is before women have started having sex, or before a young woman in particular has started having sex, that she has the knowledge and insight into her own biology to appreciate what it is, the magic of it. You were talking about magic wands.
Yeah.
But also, like, how to negotiate relationship issues and empowerment of women.
I mean, for us here at Connecting the Dots podcast, we join you as an educationalist. Science communication is very close to our heart. First of all, massive congratulations for this fantastic symposium. I have learned so much. In fact, I'm thinking I need to be able to write a paper myself and publish it. But one of the things that, from one of your presenters, I took home for women, for young girls, young women, even small girls, we all go through multiple changes during our lives. It was beautiful to see that infographic. She had an image of a child, a young girl, very young child, just a toddler, to adolescence, to reproductive age, to pregnancy, breastfeeding, perimenopause, postmenopausal. So we are joining you in the whole sexual education, because over and above, we're not saying, yes, go out there and have sex, but I think the information is always power. So what are the things that scare you? Maybe one or two. And what are the things that really excite you? And this can be either within your scientific field or broadly with the world.
So if you'd asked me a week ago what scared me, I might have had a slightly there are a couple of things that do scare me.
Yeah.
But the one that's most front of mind at the moment, that is emerging, is as HIV prevention methods are coming online, and we're getting these long-acting pre-exposure prophylaxis innovations, game changers for HIV prevention. What we're starting to see is the emergence of the common sexually transmitted infections like chlamydia, gonorrhea. And syphilis is coming back. So what we're seeing is that the strong messaging around condomizing for HIV prevention, because of these new modalities, condomizing and using condoms regularly is dropping, and that's leading to resurgence of these yesteryear pathogens that should they've got no business being here. They must go away.
Yeah.
So just to reiterate, the condoms work, and we mustn't forget that they do more than just prevent HIV. What's exciting me mostly is the opportunity. It's around the unmet need of the education piece, Juliet. I think that's so powerful, and I think there's the right players that are coming to the fore around sex education messaging, your podcast, initiatives like this, which are getting the word out there around, health and knowledge about health. So I'm campaigning for that, for having constructive conversations with women about the findings from our research to make them an active participant in finding the solution. I find that piece very exciting. And obviously, the whole reason everyone joined us in Cape Town was around microbiomes and the missing microbiomes. So I look forward to finding the missing microbiomes as a real opportunity to make a big impact, but to take community and community science along with us.
Thank you so much, Professor Passmore. This has been so engaging. We join you, as Professor Tumbi said, he enlightened us on this long-acting available treatments out there, or even, is it treatment or is it vaccines? I think it's treatment to HIV. So it's interesting that now you're seeing an increase on other diseases, like you've said, that they should be diseases of the past. So I think we are advocating for prevention being better than cure, and encouraging people, as you're saying, the use of condoms should be mainstream practice. We want to wish you good luck again. The symposium, so amazing to see yourself, well funded by the South African government. It's very rare that we see African governments coming to fund. And you also had many partners like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. For us, we're very excited to see what's the next big product or innovative device you're going to come up with. We met a few of your students, so impressed, your postdocs, your PhD students. You're doing just some stellar work in Cape Town, and kudos for you to partner with other African like-minded scientists. So we're wishing you well on your journey.
Thanks, Juliet.
Thanks for tuning in to Connecting the Dots podcast, created by me, Juliet. This episode was brought to life by Mumbua and Kevin at Silent Global in Nairobi, Kenya. If you enjoyed this episode, don't just keep it to yourself. Share it, tag us on CTD Pod Africa on all platforms. Keep the conversation going. Let us know what you'd love to hear about, and join me on the next episode as I interview the next amazing scientist here on Connecting the Dots podcast.